Hey, what's up, guys? Ambrose, Bierce, bitter Bierce. The 19th century, kind of a writer most known now for his Civil War stories and his mysterious disappearance in 1913 in his 70s. Sort of a scathing critic, but you always, when I read his stuff, his stories, he's a very modern writer. He's one of those 19th century writers that you can see is okay. He's writing how people are going to start doing things, and in the good way, in like the next 50 years. Particularly his Civil War stuff, whether it's fiction or anecdotes of his actual experience in there in the combat. It sounds like the stuff you're going to be reading 50 years later during the World Wars. Okay? And in terms of the other modern thing that he's essentially the link between Poe and Lovecraft. He brings kind of along with like Hodgson and some others. He sort of brings horror, modern horror into existence. And Lovecraft had mentioned this. This book here is pretty good. They divide up his war stuff, and some of his war stuff is supernatural. Okay, of course, the famous An Occurrence of Owl Creek Bridge is the most famous story. There's a Twilight Zone episode based on that, which is funny. It shows the Union essentially executing civilians that are trying to sabotage their effort, and one of them the guy escapes, to get back to his wife in a very unlikely way, and it's very unlikely when you see the end of it. But his horror stuff is what I'm covering here, and in terms of the horror short story, man was pretty much a self-taught writer, and he very economic style, able to build atmosphere, able to have twists in them that were clever, able to put a real sense of melancholia in them, but also humor. He was able to do all those things in just a story. Some of these are like ghost stories. A lot of these, in terms of the modern horror, you have a bunch of these that are psychological horror stories, as they like to call them. They're very effective, okay? And also there's stuff that's weird tale-ish, stuff that is essentially, you could argue, science fiction. Okay, in particular, I'm thinking about The Damn Thing, Moxon's Master, and a few of the other ones. Even An Inhabitant of Carcosa. And you have, man, so many good ones, like The Middle Toe of the Right Foot, Baby Tramp. Oh, Baby Tramp's really surreal and tragic. The Haunted Valley was his first story from 1871. Very clever story. The Man Out of the Nose. A lot of these also, he conveys, decadence. I mean, in terms of like degeneration, the decrepit, falling apart houses of the 19th century. He also gets across the fact that the protagonists in this are people of the 19th century. So they're people that electricity is a novelty at most. Many of the stories take out west, so people are used to hardship. They're used to using violence. They're used to death. These are harder people from another time, and the horror is able to even affect them. It's very interesting looking at how he managed to combine all these things, as he would write these stories in magazines. Of course, they were all called ghost stories back then, and I'll just cover a few of them, and I'll try to get to some things here because I just want to show some of the other stuff he was capable of, but not make a super long video. And Inhabitant of Carcosa. Now, the name Carcosa, of course, Chambers uses it later in The King of Yellow, and of course, Lovecraft. And this story is just the atmosphere in this. Right? The day, I thought, must be far advanced, though the sun was invisible, and although sensible that the air was raw and chill. My consciousness of that fact was rather mental than physical. I had no feeling of discomfort. Over all the dismal landscape, a canopy of low, lead-colored clouds hung like a visible curse. In all of this, there were a menace and a portent, a hint of evil, an intimation of doom. Bird, beast, or insect, there was none. The wind sighed in the bare branches of the dead trees, and the gray grass bent to whisper its dread secret to the earth. But no other sound nor motion broke the awful repose of that dismal place. very surreal, and of course the twist at the end is, well, as you can imagine, right? The applicant. This is almost like a what were the French ones? The cruel tales. So they used to call them. The French used to call them cruel tales, I guess, as a precursor to horror. Very interesting about a rest home for people, and someone trying to seek an application there. Okay, after many years, and you find out who it is related to the story. Very clever. This might be one of the more famous horror stories. Of course, Lovecraft mentions it. Some of these are they're almost like a puzzle. And in terms of another facet of his work is that you really have to read them. And you have to remember like puzzle. It's like mysteries, I guess you could say, trying to figure out how things relate to at the end. Of course, this was written not for quick consumption back in the day. But the death of Halpin Fraser brings different events in a non-linear fashion that it wasn't really common, until like the 20th century. He's doing this now, right? And something in a ghost story, he's writing for an article. And also just like the M.R. James stories, the ghosts are almost like creatures. They're very physical. When they touch you, because you're screaming as it rips your throat out. Right. Here's I'll read this. From the lustreless orbs of the apparition, which he knew was not a soul without a body, but that most dreadful of all existences infesting the haunted wood, a body without a soul. Watcher by the Dead. This is another. There's a lot of humor in this. Very strange. Daring someone to stay in the room with a cadaver, and then playing a prank, and the pranks running into even worse pranks from the beyond, or should I say Providence? But there's no supernatural thing in it. It's totally, I guess, a psychological horror. Just like The Man and the Snake is a pure psychological horror. Very funny. Dude, friggin' talk about psyching yourself out. Of course, this one's like a shock. This is like literally like almost like a shock. This is like a I don't know, a very gory little tale that's hilarious. John Mortison's funeral, very short too. Look how short it is. All right. I don't want to give away the end. Moxon's Master. This is a science fiction story. Okay, he's got an automaton in it, playing chess. Sort of like, I guess, that Poe story with the automaton that would play chess. And this is similar, except taken to a much more brutal end. The Damn Thing, of course, this is the other famous horror story he did. Okay, already getting into science fiction, that there's spectrums on the color that you can't see, right? The Damn Thing, right? And the humor too. One does not always eat what is on the table. Okay, what's on the table? Dead bodies on the table. I also like this little thing here. A lot of times, the hero, or should I say the protagonist, because there's not a lot of heroism to be done with this, is usually a young writer, just like I guess Bierce would have been. And a little funny thing here. All right. How did that happen? Your presence. He's talking to the guy that saw this man turn up dead, mysteriously. Right? He goes, How did it happen? Your presence, I mean. I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish, right? A part of my purpose, however, was to study him and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories. I sometimes read them. Thank you. Stories in general, not yours. And then the guys start laughing at him. Oh, you got owned, bro. But in the description of it, okay, very, very creepy. In terms of this guy's freaking out that he's hunting with, where he sees this thing that like he's familiar with it, the damn thing. Right, and then as he's thinking the guy's going nuts, he notices something very subtle. Right? I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seems as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it, so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly toward us. So you get into like Predator or something. Right. And like I said, the horror stories, there's, you know, some are better than others. Some of them are kind of, but most of them are really good. Right. Fruitless Assignment was pretty funny, very humorous. A Vine on the House, man. This is like a friggin' like a pre-code horror comic right there. And The Haunted Valley, I always like this one a lot. The twist in this story, I guess I don't want to give it away, but when you read this, it shows. Obviously, Bierce was a very nuanced man. He fought against the South, but he had a sympathy for the South. He was against slavery. He was against different things, but he was against his own. He was against a lot of things. He was against America in many ways. When I say that, I know how that sounds, but what I'm getting at is that his characters are not just one-dimensional characters. You have this racist Joe Dunfer, who's a drunk. He hates the Chinese, right? They're a flight of devouring locusts, and they're going for everything green in this God-blessed land, if you want to know, right? And it's funny, too, because the Easterner, the character, is berating this man for his racism, right? There's nothing about Chinamen in the New Testament, though, but you young Easterners, right? You talk all this liberal foolishness, right? But he essentially says, like, you don't have to compete against these people and work with these people who work together, right? So it's interesting that he's making the case. And then as the story goes on, you find out the interesting thing here that this guy took a liking to a Chinaman, as they say, oui, right? But then it's confusing because he seems to hate the Chinese, but when this Chinese person died, he felt so guilty that he made a grave for this person, right? Of course, it's just interesting that, I guess the twist, I could say, right? Joe Dunfer, he's Dunfer, right? A little play on there. The whole idea was that it wasn't a man, right? It was a woman, okay? And of course, I read a description of this that the term transgenderism was brought up by the modern writer in reference to this, okay? The whole point was in the story that Aoi was never a man. Aoi was probably a Chinese woman, a slave, essentially, that he was with, and she ended up going with another guy, and he killed her in a drunken rage and always felt bad about it, okay? And the whole point is, and I know this very well, is that Chinese names are genderless. Okay, so it was a very interesting twist here. That is, the modern people, they're trying to say this dude was with a Chinese trainee or something, when really it was him not disclosing the full truth. And you feel bad for the guy, okay? And you see what happens. So it's interesting story. Interesting. A lot of stuff here is good too. No toe the right foot. The guy's dueling over somebody, so that was a common thing. Still had that. Anyway, I always recommend his horror stuff. Always. Chickamauga, right? A battle, right? Like this. The man sank upon his breast, recovered, flung the small boy fiercely to the ground, as an unbroken colt might have done, then turned upon him a face that lacked a lower jaw. From the upper teeth to the throat was a great red gap, fringed with hanging shreds of flesh and splinters of bones. The unnatural prominence of nose, the absence of chin, the fierce eyes gave this man the appearance of a great bird of prey, crimsoned in throat and breast by the blood of its quarry. All right. The man rose to his knees, the child to his feet. All right. And I'll read another thing here. With the all right. He finds his mom at the end, right, after a union barrage of the town. Right. The white face turned upward, the hands thrown out and clutched full of grass, the clothing deranged, the long dark hair in tangles and full of clotted blood. The greater part of the forehead was torn away, and from the jagged hole the brain protruded, overflowing the temple, a frothy mass of gray crowned with clusters of crimson bubbles, the work of a shell. This is some gory horror story. No, this is the fucking Civil War. Ambrose Bierce knew real horror in war, and the horror of existence. Later.